So that fateful day, April 7th, 1968, I think we can see, using the categories of the rhetorical situation, to see how Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, transformed what could have been a scene of anger, of frustration, even violence, into a scene that became a kind of funeral, a kind of downtown urban funeral, a celebration of the life of Martin Luther King, and an argument against violence at the same time. So in terms of the speaker, the category of the speaker, this audience obviously liked Robert F. Kennedy, was turning out to his campaign rally, but they necessarily wouldn't have turned to him to deliver the bad news about Martin Luther King. They certainly didn't expect to hear this news. And so in terms of the speaker, Robert F. Kennedy really faced a crisis of credibility. Why should this audience believe him, to trust him, to tell them not to turn to violence, not to turn to anger, and expressing their frustrations with Martin Luther King's death? And he does so in a couple of ways in his speech. His somber tone really helps to communicate that. He identifies with his audience very specifically by talking about his own slain brother, who he says was also murdered by a white man. He gives these incredible quotations from the Greek poet Aeschylus that talk about how hard it is to come to grips with your own mortality and the mortality of those around you. In terms of the speech, I think the key lines that emerge from the speech that help assuage the fears and frustrations, at least momentarily, from the crowd are: how does King deliver this somber news? The subject of the speech is just truly tragic for the audience that day, and what he does through those categories that I just mentioned about how he's speaking so somberly, how he's speaking so meaningfully, how he's making a powerful argument against violence, because violence, he says, begets more and more and more violence. It becomes a cycle of violence, and it becomes self-defeating. It's no way to honor the life of Martin Luther King, and so he's able to credibly make that argument before his audience that day. In terms of the audience, what Kennedy had to understand was who he was speaking to. He was speaking to his own campaign constituency. At the time, he was trying to mobilize a kind of army of young people, of minorities, of Latinos and African Americans, of poor folks, and of college students to try to win the presidency in 1968. And so he knew his audience pretty well, and he knew the themes, especially, that King spoke about as well. King was famously nonviolent, and Kennedy, in turn, used his own brother's death as well as King's teachings to make a powerful claim that the audience should seek to emulate those ideals in the way that they carry forth the ideal of King and King's legacy. And then finally, what is most amazing to me about this speech and watching this speech 40 years later or so is how the occasion becomes interesting. And so Kennedy has a real problem when he steps to the podium that day. And it is that the crowd, who is incredibly excited, they're at this rah-rah political pep rally. They think they're a part of a new national political movement led by Robert F. Kennedy to take the presidency of the United States, to win the Democratic nomination, and then defeat perhaps Richard Nixon in the 1968 election. And the first words out of his mouth are some of the worst words they'll ever hear, that Martin Luther King has been shot and killed earlier that morning. And so through his speech, he's able to take what is a rhetorical problem, an obstacle to influence, an obstacle to persuasion, which is that he's delivering incredibly tragic news, and turn, through his masterful words, turn this occasion into a funeral, into a somber celebration of King's life and King's ideals.